I was so happy to visit when I was there just last week. Today's event is part of a series on how U.S. Italy engagement can help North African countries overcome their differences and flourish in becoming politically stable and economically developed countries. By engaging our international allies, including some of our most important allies like Italy, we believe that we can help strengthen the transatlantic ties in a way that is helpful to North Africa and the wider Mediterranean community. We truly hope to continue this collaboration in the future in order to see sustained policies come into fruition for the long term. Of course, great power competition has made its way to the Middle East and North Africa. It's no surprise to anyone, I'm sure, that's watching this today and that's in the room. Amid the perception of American pivot away from the region, perception that persists and is very damaging, but fundamentally untrue. China and Russia are increasing their influence by signing key trade agreements, by collaborating with a number of countries, and by the really damaging activities of the Russian Wagner paramilitary group. Furthermore, Russia's war in Ukraine is leading to inflation in the price of bread, grain, and oil across the region, in addition to the horrible humanitarian and war crimes that we're seeing in Ukraine itself. Today in this panel, we're going to explore how the United States and its European allies can engage in a more coordinated policy to the ongoing challenges in the North Africa region, driven by events within the region, but also driven by what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. I'm also very grateful to be joined today by Fernandino Saleo and Thomas Smitham. Ambassador Saleo served, as many of us in Washington know, 1995 to 2003 as the Italian ambassador to the United States. And he's currently a member of the board at the Center for American Studies. Thomas Smitham is the chargé at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Prior to this position, he was the chargé at the U.S. Embassy in Trinidad and Tobago and a political minister counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. We're going to hear from Ambassador Saleo first, and then from Chargé Smitham, and then we're going to hear our keynote. So first, over to you, Ambassador Saleo.
Gentlemen, first of all, I wish to thank Mr. Wesley for the very kind words he had for me. But I wish to say that the Center is happy and proud to have this important seminar, exchange of views, political exercise in analysis, eventually in planning with the Atlantic Council. Few organizations have such a distinguished board like the Atlantic Council, with names that have been very important in the international world and have brought indeed a strong contribution. We live in difficult times. What was supposed to be a time of the rule of law in the international world, of method, of mutual respect, has turned into a time of chaos, unpredictable actions, and a sort of general moral decay. In this respect, Europe finds itself in an uncomfortable geographic situation, but as the old saying goes, you cannot change your geographic location for a better one. The Ukrainian crisis, the aggression to this country that had tried to establish a democratic regime is unheard of in recent times. And together with the turmoil on our southern frontier, as I call it, the southern frontier of Europe, which is the Sahel, create a situation where my own country finds itself in a particularly hard time. And again, this is an occasion where our Center for American Studies, together with the Atlantic Council, can consult, try to find out from the best minds the advice, I would say the recipes, if there are any, and in any case, a perfect analysis of the situation on which governments can base their action. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and good morning. Good morning. Oh, well, no, good afternoon, Washington, too. I got to look at my watch more often. I have one of the easier jobs because I come right before my distinguished colleague, Yael Lempart, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and one of our leading professionals on Middle East policy. So she will provide a real dose of the substance here. But I just wanted to make a couple of brief introductory remarks. First of all, thank you for the Center for American Studies for hosting and collaborating on this event. Thank you to Mr. Wexler and the Atlantic Council for their work on this. Thanks to our own public affairs team at the Embassy for collaborating with all of the above. Last month, the Atlantic Council hosted the Prime Minister of Italy, Prime Minister Draghi, in Washington for the Distinguished Leader Award. Everybody there was dressed much nicer than you are all dressed here today. There were a lot of tuxedos and cocktail dresses, and it was a quite nice event. But it was also a nice event because it encapsulated what has been an extraordinary year in U.S. Italy relations. As those of you who have followed this will know, Italy hosted the G20 this year. Italy hosted President Biden this year, and many of our ministers as well. And the Atlantic Council event was part of a visit that Prime Minister Draghi made to Washington, where he also engaged with President Biden in the Oval Office. And I think all of those events show the depth and the richness of the U.S.-Italy relationship. The topic here today is almost too big for one panel, even as distinguished a panel as we have set up here today, because it has to do with the broader issues of the Mediterranean basin and how the U.S. and Italy and the U.S. and other countries can collaborate on promoting safety, security, food security, energy security in this region. And it's not an easy task. And from the Italy perspective, or from the U.S.-Italy perspective, the issue we spend most time on is Libya and how we can work together to promote a peaceful political transition there. It has not been easy for those of you who have followed that issue. But the war in Ukraine and the unjustified invasion by Russia of Ukraine has also brought up a few other issues that touch very importantly on the Mediterranean region. In particular, food security, which is one that is affecting a lot of the countries in North Africa and on which the U.S., Italy, and U.S. and other countries in the region are trying to help provide and build solutions. Energy security is another issue that we've focused on. And then, as I think Mr. Wexler said initially, how to work on broader political and economic transitions in the region to make sure that we are helping those countries developed to their full potential. So I'm going to leave it there and leave it to our experts to dive into our policy objectives in the region. But I just want to close again by thanking the collaboration of all of you here, the CISA, the Atlantic Council, our public affairs team, and more broadly, our Italian government counterparts who have worked so diligently, I would say, to promote stability in Northern Africa, and on which we are very happy to partner with Italy and other countries in the region to promote a safer and more just future for all those in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those wonderful opening remarks. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Yael Lampert, who Mr. Smitham already told you who she is, and for all of us who work on Middle East issues from Washington, she needs no introduction. Yael is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department. She was until recently the Acting Assistant Secretary. She's been working on issues in the region and on issues in Europe for much of her career, and is one of the most informed people that I know on these subjects. After Yael speaks, then the floor will go to Karim Mesrand, who will introduce the panel. Karim leads our North Africa work at the Atlantic Council and is in Rome. So with no further ado, Yael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Will, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure and it's an honor to join you and Ambassador Saleo and our chargé and everybody who is participating today. Buongiorno a tutti. I only wish I could be joining you in person in the Eternal City rather than virtually, but I'll take what I can get. As Tom Smitham said, and I just want to underscore, it is our rock solid partnership with Italy, as well as with our other vital European allies, that provides a critical foundation for engagement across North Africa and the Middle East. We share together a commitment to a stable, peaceful, and more prosperous region, and we'll succeed when we work together, and our unity of effort remains essential to address the array of issues that I will speak about briefly today. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that I've benefited enormously in a myriad of ways throughout my career in the region from the partnerships and advice and collaboration with our European partners. So I feel this very, very viscerally and personally. And I would also like to begin by noting how Russia's brutal war against Ukraine has put a spotlight on our partnerships across North Africa and the Middle East. We've been asking our partners and our allies to take a stand against Russia's unprovoked aggression and its violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, also a violation of the foundational principle of the UN Charter. The choice is clear, and in this moment, we should expect more from our regional partners, even as they ask more from us. In the administration's interim national security strategic guidance, President Biden articulated a positive strategic vision for U.S. engagement in the Middle East and North Africa, committing us to a more sustainable set of long-term relationships with our partners. And these relationships should feature an affirmative agenda, one that focuses on solving shared problems and building shared prosperity. Unfortunately, as we pursue these goals, a narrative has emerged in some corners that the United States is leaving the Middle East and North Africa. And that narrative, which, as Will noted, is regrettably pervasive, that narrative is wholly incorrect, as becomes abundantly clear upon reviewing the breadth of American engagement throughout the region. The administration's efforts in the Indo-Pacific are not mutually exclusive with our sustained efforts in the Middle East. As we Americans would say, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. You've all heard President Biden articulate a very clear focus on the Indo-Pacific. And Secretary Blinken, in his recent speech, called the rise of the People's Republic of China the defining challenge of our age. Aligning with our friends and partners around the world is a central organizing principle to meet this challenge. As Secretary Blinken said, this isn't about forcing countries to choose, it's about giving them a choice. We'll cooperate with China where we can, confront where we must, and compete confident in the value of prosperous North Africa and Middle East matters to the United States, to Europe, and to Asia. So we remain and we will remain engaged in the Middle East and North Africa to de-escalate conflicts and to use diplomacy to build a sustainable future of US involvement in the region. Over the long run, together, we must embrace a more expansive view of regional stability, moving beyond traditional security challenges. As the world changes, our definition of security has to change with it. We will keep human rights a focus in our engagement with the region, and with good reason. Together with our partners like Italy, our common values and beliefs in a rules-based democratic order stand in marked contrast to competitors destabilizing the region through military opportunism and economic coercion. The states that will be best equipped to meet the challenges of our changing world, such as COVID-19 and climate change, will be those with resilient, inclusive governments that treat civil society as a partner rather than an enemy, and respect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of their people, such as freedom of expression, including for members of the press. The COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced the necessity of working together. We have life-saving vaccines, but we need to cooperate to get shots in arms. To date, the US has donated over 35 million life-saving vaccine doses across the Middle East and North Africa, the vast majority provided through COVAX. Every time one of those 35 million doses is used, we build immunity, we equip populations to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. And our cooperation with Europe and with our partners throughout the Middle East and North Africa to address climate change is also going to be critical. Rising temperatures and desertification have led to deadly wildfires, drought, lethally high temperatures, and devastating sandstorms. Together, our efforts can make progress. Egypt and Morocco are leaders in renewable energy deployment. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others in the region have released plans for net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. 11 countries in the region signed on to the Global Methane Pledge to reduce methane emissions. We hope other countries will be able to demonstrate their climate ambition as well. It's so critical for the future of the region. And with COP27 coming up in Egypt and the UAE hosting COP28 next year, we're working with both governments to ensure these upcoming summits produce meaningful, lasting commitments to protect our climate and help protect people, including in the region, from the worst effects of warming. Working together, we also, on the political level, are delivering transformational change. The Abraham Accords and normalization represent one of the most regionally significant strategic shifts in recent years. And building on that breakthrough is a focus for the administration. I was privileged to be at the ministerial in March in the Negev when the foreign ministers of Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, Israel, the UAE, and the US gathered together for the first time. Together, we're now working to build a common vision of a more peaceful, prosperous, and integrated region. And it's that kind of cooperation and putting flesh on the bones of the Abraham Accords that will help produce greater stability and security. One of the most innovative projects, brokered by Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry, is termed Project Prosperity. It's a solar plant in Jordan, financed by UAE energy company Masdar, that will send clean, renewable electricity from Jordan to Israel as Israel sends fresh water to Jordan. It's a model of sustainable development and innovation only made possible through regional cooperation. Extending this cooperation further, we're now working together with additional countries. The economic grouping that we call the I2U2, Israel, India, UAE, and the United States, it emerged from a first ever call between Secretary Blinken and his Israeli, UAE, and Indian counterparts last year. We want to build on that and also focus on deepening and building upon the Abraham Accords, but I also want to underscore for this audience that we are cognizant while we do that, that is no substitute for a negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. And as Secretary Blinken has said, we all must build on these relationships and growing normalization to make tangible improvements in the lives of Palestinians and to make progress towards a longstanding goal of advancing a negotiated peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Palestinians and Israelis deserve equal measures of freedom, security, opportunity, and dignity. We feel, and the president and the secretary and others in the administration have made very clear, that a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state, living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state. Meanwhile, there's plenty of other work in the region as well, and we're working as hard as ever to de-escalate regional conflicts, not alone, but alongside our partners around the world, including our very, very close allies in Rome. The Biden administration has fully recommitted to the United Nations and its efforts in support of peace. We support UN-facilitated peace processes in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and the Western Sahara. Our efforts in Yemen have helped lead to an extension of a truce, the first since 2016, that has brought relief and hope to millions. The past 2 months have been among the most peaceful periods in the past 7 years of war, saving literally thousands of lives as fighting has receded. In Syria, our partnership is vital to continue promoting accountability for the ongoing atrocities committed by the Assad regime. We continue to call for a nationwide ceasefire, unhindered aid access through all modalities, including through the reauthorization of the cross-border mechanism by the UN Security Council, the humane release of those arbitrarily detained, and clarification of the whereabouts or fate of those who remain missing. And in Libya, a topic near and dear, I know, to many in the audience today, our transatlantic partnerships have played a central role in helping to secure a ceasefire that has now held for 19 months and a political process that has shifted the focus from violent confrontation to political negotiation. This partnership remains crucial so that the Libyan people can ultimately achieve their demand to choose their leaders through free and fair elections, a demand that is very, very clearly manifested through the polling in Libya that makes clear the great interest in those elections, as well as the voter registration numbers that we've seen. In Western Sahara, we are fully engaged diplomatically in support of the efforts of Staffan de Mistura, the personal envoy of the Secretary General, to produce a mutually agreed solution to the dispute. We think there's a real opportunity now. And we're also committed to ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. And we continue to believe that the JCPOA is the best way to address Iran's nuclear program. Many of our regional partners, it will come as no surprise to those of you listening, many of them have a deep concern, as do we, about Iran's support for terrorism and fueling of regional conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. My colleague, Rob Malley, recently testified to Congress, noting that we harbor no illusions. The Iranian government clearly remains a threat. It's sowing instability across the region, and we will remain steadfast in our efforts to stop them. Iran continues to exploit regional conflict and weak societies, and building stronger partners and partnerships is one of the most effective ways to counter Iran's destabilizing influence. And I want to underscore that finally, in an age of strategic competition, we want partners to look to Washington. The United States had $137 billion in trade with North African and Middle Eastern partners in 2019. Post-pandemic, we want to build on that trading relationship. For comparison, total Chinese investment in the region was less than half of the United States. U.S. private sector investment in the Middle East and North Africa increased faster than anywhere else in the world in the 10 years before the pandemic, more than doubling from 34 billion to 75 billion from 2010 to 2019. This is thanks to the work of our governments in fostering, all of our governments in fostering open business environments that create strong trade partnerships in agriculture, energy, aircraft, and automobiles, to name a few. We offer support for a rules-based international order, a dynamic global economy, and respect for democracy and human rights, as I noted at the outset. Both Russia and the People's Republic of China have attempted to increase their influence across the Middle East, and both have been found lacking in their commitment to the region. Neither country has shown any success in de-escalating, let alone resolving regional conflicts. China has profited and benefited from the security the United States military has provided in the region. And while China may be seeking to expand its regional footprint, Beijing has shown little interest in building and maintaining regional security, a role that the United States has played for decades. The People's Republic of China has increased its investment in trade throughout the Middle East and North Africa. But as Secretary Blinken recently pointed out, globally, and this holds true in the region as well, China often delivers opaque investments that leave countries in debt, stoke corruption, harm the environment, fail to create local jobs or growth, and compromise countries' exercise of their sovereignty. We've heard firsthand about buyer's remorse that these deals can leave behind. In North Africa and in the Sahel, Russia is using the Wagner Group to try to increase Russian influence with supposed plausible deniability. Addressing this threat on NATO's southern flank requires really strong transatlantic cooperation, including between Italy and the U.S. We've seen how Russia's war against Ukraine has spread instability worldwide, including threatening global food security, as we heard in some of the introductions, as Russia blocks ships in the Black Sea from delivering wheat to key partners in North Africa, the Middle East, and the rest of the world. And this is a major topic of conversation currently with our regional partners and a major focus for us. And I want to be clear, sanctions have not caused a food security crisis. The United States imposed sanctions to press Russia to end the war as soon as possible. The global food security crisis that we see today is the direct result of President Putin's brutal war, and it requires a global response. We will align with our allies and partners in Europe, across the Middle East and North Africa, and throughout the world on this critical issue, but others as well, to advance a shared vision for the future. I'm very sorry, as I noted at the outset, that I can't be there in person today to really engage on the substance of the discussions that will come next. And I know, given the august group that is assembled, that it's going to be quite a discussion. So I would just ask, in your conversations today as you deliberate, I want to pose a few questions for you to help us define that shared future vision for the region. First, how will climate change reshape this conversation in 3 to 5 years? What issues should we be talking about now? And what partnerships are we going to need to address them? Further, how can we best unlock the regional cooperation and ties we know are needed to address the climate, health, and development challenges of the next decade? And lastly, where should the region fit in the emerging transatlantic discussion of strategic competition? How can the United States and Europe be most effective in this regard? I'll close by thanking you in advance for your insights and your answers and your advice on those questions. And also note that we remain optimistic about the region's future, but quite clear-eyed about the work that is needed to realize the potential that is out there. And we're deeply grateful for the partnership, the support, and the collaboration of our Italian partners and other European allies as we work together on the manifold challenges and opportunities ahead of us. With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to somebody I have great respect and regard for, and I'm looking forward to hearing his insights, Karim Mezran. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Yeah, you've been great as usual. I really appreciate your intervention and your very nice words. And we'll do our best to provide some answer to your very tough questions. And I'll see you soon in DC. Thanks again. And thank you also, Will, for your introduction and for always being there with us and helping us. My name is Karim Mezran. I'm the director of the North Africa Initiative with the Rafik Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us here in person, a good number of you, and also about 200, 250 of you online are following us. I will try to push our eminent speakers to answer the questions that I will ask them, and then if possible, if we have time at the end, I will allow for a couple of questions from you if you have any, so that you can directly engage our speakers. Having said that, I would like to start with one of the distinguished guests we have today, is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia, Dr. Khmayes Jehnawi, who served from 2016 to 2019 as the Foreign Minister of Tunisia, and previously served as Ambassador to Russia and Ukraine, out of all places. And he is the founder of the Tunisian Council for International Relations. Thank you very much for being here with us. I know it's a very important moment for you, and thank you. I really appreciate that you are here with us. I would like to ask you if you can provide an initial framework, a panorama of the region with a special focus on how you see the most recent geopolitical shifts that have rocked the Mediterranean. How do you view the Russian, the Emirati, and the Turkish meddling in the region and all this interaction? And of course, feel free also to address whatever issue you have it at heart.
Can I speak from there?
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am really delighted to be here today, and I would like to thank the Atlantic Council and particularly my good friend Karim Mezran for his kind invitation. Today's theme is a pretty hot topic, given the speed with which international relations are developing and the dramatic news overload we are receiving on a daily basis. Ladies and gentlemen, MENA region is facing a profound geopolitical shift, prompting unprecedented levels of unpredictability and instability. The region has been deeply affected by the Arab Spring, as you know, of 2011, and is wary today of the possible fallouts of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Most of the countries are still experiencing the dramatic economic and social consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. The ongoing war in Ukraine is having its own impact on the geopolitics of the MENA region. The UN vote on March 2nd illustrated each country's stance about the Russian invasion. In North Africa and the Maghreb, 5 countries didn't vote the same. Tunisia and Libya voted for the resolution. Algeria abstained, and Morocco didn't take part of the vote. With the exception of Iraq and Iran, who abstained, other Middle Eastern countries supported the resolution while choosing carefully their words to explain their vote. They refrained from explicitly condemning Russia. Syria predictably voted in favor of Russia and expressed its intent to recognize the breakaway provinces of Lugansk and Donetsk. Many countries of the region have refused to publicly chastise Russia, and some, notably Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, have taken some heat from that in the United States as a result. Both countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, which has long close military ties with the United States, have ignored Washington's request to pump more oil to ease price pressure following the Western sanction on Russia. The decision of OPEC Plus on June 3rd to boost its output next July remains largely symbolic as Riyadh tests U.S. intent towards the Gulf region ahead of President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia by the end of this month. Many countries in the region and beyond regard the war in Ukraine as a regional conflict, not as a grave threat to global security and the world order as portrayed by some countries in the West. Some countries have put their national interest above calls by the US to isolate and sanction Russia. Israel and Turkey refrained from condemning publicly Russia and endeavored in various stages of the war to serve as mediators between Kiev and Moscow to carry out its regional goals in Syria and Iraq. Turkey even hosted a meeting between Russian and Ukrainian delegations in an attempt to reach a ceasefire and mediate the conflict. As a whole, most countries looked to protect their relation with Russia, clearly convinced that the world is moving towards multipolarity. However, as Russia invaded Ukraine and the West rallied together against the Russian invasion, MENA countries have found themselves in a strategic bind. Return to the Western sphere of influence or continue to straddle both spheres. But are they really in a bind, a strategic bind? Or there are opportunities stemming from the current crisis for better relationship between the transatlantic and countries and the MENA region? Russian invasion of Ukraine is clearly affecting power and politics in the MENA, and the Euromed process in particular. Southern Mediterranean countries fear that the shift of focus towards security and the later stage towards economic reconstruction in Ukraine and possibly other parts of Eastern Europe risks making the interest of Southern Mediterranean countries less of a priority for the European Union. Fewer resources would be available for regional development projects and vertical integration. With Europe depending at around 30% level of Russian gas imports, and with newly imposed economic, financial, and trade-oriented sanctions against Russian leaders, oil and gas exporting Middle Eastern countries are expected to increase their political leverage over European leaders by bidding to fill the gap left by the vacuum in the Russian gas supplies. That would give many governments of the region respite from European pressure for reforms. From the European perspective, the focus would be rather oriented to combating illegal immigration, transborder trafficking, and terrorism. MENA political and economic reforms are likely to be put on the back burner, and democratic transition could lose momentum. European and US approaches to the MENA region have been always different, but complementary. In fact, North Africa and the Middle East have never constituted one single politically homogeneous space. The US has always given priority to the Middle East in its diplomatic and military outreach efforts and viewed this region mostly through the prism of the Arab-Israeli conflict, its energy interest, its strategic relationship with Turkey, and its conflict with Iran. The European Union developed its relation with the Southern Mediterranean partners through the neighborhood policy, seeking to expand trade and investment and to deploy its soft power through aid and security cooperation to political dialogue and boost incentives to democratic transition. Unfortunately, neither policy succeeded in creating the projected spaces of stability and nor prosperity enshrined in the 1995 Euromed Barcelona Declaration or the various public declarations that followed the euphoria generated by the Oslo Middle East peace process. All major global and regional cleavage are in display as the region is experiencing the dramatic consequences of the Russian war in the Ukraine. Conflicts are on the rise, and there is no sign that tension is diminishing. These include the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Israeli-Iranian antagonism, the Russian-Western confrontation in Syria, the US-Israel opposition to the Iranian nuclear program, the Yemen conflict and the Saudi-Iranian confrontation in that country, the Turkish-European Union tension in Eastern Mediterranean, as well as the ongoing proxy confrontation of major international and regional players on the Libyan soil. Energy supply, immigration, and climate change are also potential sources of tension and conflicts in the whole region. The European Union and the US share the same goal of promoting regional stability in both Middle East and the Maghreb. A comprehensive MENA road map will require, however, a differential approach tailored to the specificities of each region. To cement a new strategic partnership, let me suggest a few ideas. One is that the US and the European Union should act immediately to limit the economic and social fallouts of the Russian war in Ukraine, particularly the worries stemming from the blockade of Ukraine grain export due to the Russian invasion. Food crisis and hunger are looming in many MENA and sub-Saharan African countries and should urgently be addressed before becoming a source of human disaster and massive immigration and instability in the whole region. Two, on a broader basis, Europe and the US have to re-engage with the MENA region and to project an even-handed approach towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Double standard positions are badly felt in the region. The hope generated by the peace process has been waning, and that strong feeling explained, at least in part, realignment of the Arab public opinion on Russia's position in the war in Ukraine. A firm commitment to the two-state solution will create a new momentum for peace in the region, increase its security, and open new opportunities for investment and trade and new partnership with the transatlantic countries. Three, a special effort should also be made to end the war in Syria, to decrease tension in that country, resettle refugees, and put a term to foreign interference in its domestic affairs. It will also show a real commitment to the restoration of peace in Syria and the whole region, and the emergence of new leadership in Damascus. Four, encourage homegrown reforms, favoring good governance and democratic transition in the region. The war in Ukraine should not serve as an excuse to turn away from the political crisis that some countries of the region are witnessing. A special emphasis should be placed on macroeconomic reforms to make the region more attractive for business and foreign investment and to further encourage regional integration. Lack of economic progress has affected the credibility of the democratic transition process and eroded trust in political elite in the region. More than 75 years after the creation of the Arab League in 1945, Arab economic integration remains elusive, in contrast with European and South Asian cases. Despite numerous initiatives, the region lacks institutional mechanism to carry out this integration process and broad regional level. Lacking adequate regional mechanism, the region has failed to cooperate effectively on issues related to pandemic and food security. It is likely to fail to meet the challenges posed by climate change, as recently demonstrated by the unprecedented sandstorms caused by droughts and desertification. Six, in Libya there is a need from the US and the European Union to exert further pressure on the Libyan main actors, as well as regional powers and their proxies on Libyan soil to halt hostilities, resume negotiation under UN umbrella, and lay the ground for free and fair parliamentary and presidential election in the country. But a more focused and pragmatic approach by the international community is needed to avoid the fiasco of the December 2021 election while preventing tension from spinning out of the control. 7, a more stable and integrated Maghreb would serve as a reliable partner to help favoring the settlement of chronic crises in the region, including the crisis in Libya and the prevailing tension between Algeria and Morocco. Attention to solving difficulties between Algeria and Morocco should be as much as a priority as seeking gas security from deals with one country or another. 8, the US and the European Union should also partner with MENA states and civil society to build a new regional institutional framework which will serve as a platform to promote dialogue among countries of the region, help encourage preventive diplomacy, and resolve pending conflicts. The MENA lacks institutional platform similar to that performed by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. A new security architecture will offer the most needed platform to discuss matters of stability, peace, democracy, and development in the region. It will encourage political dialogue as a way to solve difference and promote preventive diplomacy. It will also bridge difference and build trust between different stakeholders in the MENA region and beyond. These are just few ideas to be a basis for future dialogue and brainstorming how to develop and relaunch these important relationship between Europe, United States, and North Africa and the Middle East, particularly in this time of crisis where people and countries, they are disoriented. They don't know exactly how the world is going to be in the future. And I think if we focus on few ideas, some of these few ideas, we can, I think, build a new partnership which will be mutually beneficial for both the transatlantic alliance as well as North Africa and the Middle East, but also mainly it will be important for the development of that region and for the security of the whole region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. Thanks a lot for your comments and your suggestions, very important ones. I'd also like to introduce now Jonathan Fulton, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan is one of the utmost experts on China today. He has written widely on the topic for both academic and popular publications. He's the author, among others, of China's relations with the Gulf monarchies and co-editor of External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies. Jonathan is also assistant professor of political science in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zaid University. Jonathan, are you with us now? Okay.
I am. Thanks for the introduction, Kareem.
Very well. Can you talk about China's strategy in the Middle East and North Africa? What about China's viewpoint on the perception of American withdrawal? What is China's view and its behavior toward Russia in North Africa and the Middle East? Is it collaboration, competition, opposition? If you can shed some light on this, we will be very grateful.
Well, I'll do my best. So thanks for the invitation to speak with you all today. Like everybody else, I wish I could be with you in person. Instead, I'm here in Abu Dhabi, where it's very, very, very hot. But yeah, so the issue of China, I think I'll address your questions, but maybe not in the order you gave them. I'll start with the idea of the perception of U.S. Leaving the region. And I think a couple of things that have to be brought up. I think, first of all, I don't believe that Chinese policymakers believe that to be the case. There was a really good report written by Michael Swain at the China Leadership Monitor last year. And he said, if you look at media outlets, you'll see in the newspapers, on TV and the radio, a lot of pundits saying the US is in decline, the US is leaving. But the higher up you got, the less you got any kind of people talking that way. And when you got to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, that was a very, very unpopular idea that very few people held. I think China has a very clear understanding of US power and influence, and especially in the Middle East. I think especially if you look at, just comparatively, any US top-ranked official over the past 25 years, whether it's secretaries of defense or folks from the State Department or National Security Council, a lot of those people have deep experience in the Middle East, where they developed a lot of professional achievements. You see a lot of people in the Middle East, in the US government, that have tremendous networks throughout the region, personal and professional networks. You see great area studies programs across US universities. It just doesn't exist to the same extent in China, right? They're the new guys here. The personal relationships among Chinese officials and Middle Eastern officials is still at a pretty early stage. You don't see the same kind of area studies happening throughout Chinese universities. And I think the same thing goes in the other direction. I work at a university here in Abu Dhabi. Very few of my students are studying China. There are very few people in the Arabian Gulf, or sorry, not the Arabian Peninsula, who are studying China in any serious way. So I think, we tend to see China as a major player here, and I think it's just important to right size it. The U.S. presence compared to the Chinese presence is very, 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 very different. Now, in terms of China's strategy in the region, I think this is also something that we have to be pretty cognizant of what China's, the ranking of China's priorities. There's a great book published about 10 years ago by two American China specialists, Andrew Nathan and Andrew Scoble. It's called China's Search for Security. And when they talked about Chinese security interests, they looked at these four concentric circles. The first circle is China's core interests. This is what really matters. And what really matters is the tremendous domestic pressures the Chinese Communist Party is facing every single day, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's job creation, whether it's demographic imbalance, whether it's regional disparity between people who live in the coastal cities and have access to great jobs, or the people who are off in the Western regions and don't have the same opportunity. You add to that things like pressures in Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong. Most of Chinese leaders' bandwidth is focusing inward. And then, you get into the second circle, and you're looking at these 20 countries that China shares borders or maritime boundaries with, and a lot of those countries are problematic, whether they're weak states like Pakistan or Afghanistan or North Korea. And you've got rival states like Japan and South Korea. You've got India, with that China's been fighting, has had actual conflict with in recent years. And then you realize China's very much preoccupied, within its own region. Then you look at these big regional orders, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. Chinese leaders have a lot to consider. It's only when you get that fourth circle, which is basically the rest of the world, where you see where the Middle East fits in China's hierarchy. It's not as important as we tend to think of it. So what are China's interests here? They do have interests. China's regional strategy, I would argue, is very interest-driven, and those interests are primarily economic. China's engagement in the region is heavily dominated by trade and contracting. A lot of regional countries have deep development needs. You see these vision programs, Saudi Vision 2030, Egypt Vision 2030, New Kuwait 2035. All of this stuff requires a lot of infrastructure development and tech infrastructure. This is stuff that Chinese companies do very well here. So, China has largely looked at the region as a place to do business. They've done very well at it. When you figure the Belt and Road Initiative into that, you see China's top trade partner over the past several years has been the European Union. Of course, you can't get to the EU without passing through the Middle East. So I think China's also seen political engagement in the region as also supporting its broader, economic interests across the Indian Ocean region and into the Mediterranean. Now, in achieving those interests, I think China's, up until very recently, I'd say about 2018, China seemed very content to operate under the U.S. security architecture. As one of the previous speakers did mention from the State Department, China has been free riding under a lot of U.S. security commitments, but that's no different from almost every other country that engages in the region. Japan, Korea, India, Singapore, the UK, a lot of these countries have also taken advantage of this U.S. security commitment to broaden their political and economic engagement throughout the region. And I think what differs, of course, is those countries are all U.S. allies or partners, and China is a competitor. The China-U.S. relationship seemed to have that kind of awkward interdependence up until the Trump administration. That at that point, when the trade war was announced, I think Chinese logic changed dramatically, where they thought they do have massive economic interests in the region. They require Gulf energy for a lot of their domestic growth. All of that stuff was being secured by the U.S. Navy. And now they're thinking, well, if the U.S. is going to weaponize trade, they have to think about the region a little differently. Now, again, the Middle East is not a core interest for China. I think when they look at it, they see a lot of opportunity. But I think one of the more strategic opportunities that they've seen since this recalibration of the China-U.S. relationship is that the Middle East in general and the Gulf in particular presents an opportunity to kind of muck up the U.S. foreign policy agenda in competing with China. How is the U.S. going to pivot away from the Middle East and towards China if the Fifth Fleet is constantly stuck in the Gulf trying to contain Iran? So you see China, especially since the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, China has been enhancing its engagement with Iran. I don't think this is because Iran offers China very much in real terms, other than keeping the U.S. preoccupied. We've seen that most of China's most valuable regional relationships are also U.S. allies and partners, other than Iran. The UAE is a massively, I would argue, it's the pillar of China's Middle East policy. There's a Chinese expatriate population here of around 300,000 people, by far the biggest in the Middle East. They do a lot of diverse trade. They work on a lot of the COVID vaccine program. The UAE actually offers China quite a bit, as does Saudi. I think China always had looked at those countries as very important partners to the U.S., which provides stability politically and economically to these partners that China also considers important. And I think up until that period, 2018, I think China said, hey, why mess with a good thing? As long as we continue getting what we need, then they seem quite content to not rock the boat. I think the logic of great power competition, or strategic competition, as it's been rebranded under the Biden administration, changes, again, the logic in Beijing, where the Middle East is a place where China can compete with the U.S. We've seen here in the Gulf in recent, over the past year or so, stories that China was talking about building a military installation here in Abu Dhabi, that they're helping the Saudis develop their indigenous ballistic missile program. All the while, senior Chinese leaders have been kind of verbally poking at the U.S. when they talk with, there was a meeting of 6 Middle Eastern foreign ministers. They went to China earlier this year. When they left, China's foreign minister Wang Yi said, the Middle East is for Middle Easterners. You don't need outside powers interfering. There's no need for foreign patriarchs. The reason the region has been so destabilized is because of interference from outside powers. And, then they offered China as an alternative, saying, we don't do geopolitics the same way. We focus on development. We focus on economics. We focus on things you need. That resonates. Now, I think what's happening is China is throwing these punches because they're trying to build wedges between the U.S. and its allies and partners to make the U.S. seem a less reliable partner. Because, despite what we all know, that the U.S. is not leaving the region, I live here. It's taken as a matter of fact when I talk to people, whether they're my students, whether they're officials, whether they're think tankers, academics, journalists, whatever. It's very hard to convince people that despite robust weapon sales or military training or commitment, military cooperation, there's still this idea that the U.S. wants to leave. I think the designation of the Indo-Pacific as a priority theater is taken by many actors in the region as a sign that the U.S. is leaving, or wants to leave rather. And I think also just the fact that the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi has been so frosty has made it harder to convince people in the region otherwise. So I think it's pretty complicated. I think China's strategy, again, I think China would be very happy to just continue signing contracts, doing trade, working on things that make money for them. I don't think they're really interested in competing in the region in the same way that the U.S. is framing this strategic competition. I'm quite certain that actors in the region, and this is just the Gulf where I live, you know, if you look across the board, many Gulf officials have said we're very uncomfortable with this. We're being forced into impossible choices. You know, we don't see it as a binary. We think we can work with the U.S. on some things and China on other things. Now, Secretary Blinken's speech from May 26th has talked about reshaping the environment in which China operates. And I think that's a fine strategy, but I think, you know, there's also room for China to try to do the same thing. You can see places where China could try to increase that wedge with key actors and say, look, we offer certain things, no strings attached. We're not going to chastise you about human rights. We're not going to talk to you about free and fair elections. We're not going to ask you to ignore the importance you attach with Russia. We're going to meet you on your terms, no expectations. And that's something that I think resonates. Now, the last part, because you did ask Karim about the China-Russia relationship and how that factors here. I published a report with my friend and frequent collaborator, Dr. Li Chen Sim. She's a Russia expert and an energy expert. And so we published a report in March for the Atlantic Council looking at how China and Russia are engaging the Middle East across security, diplomatic engagement, public diplomacy, and economic engagement. And no surprise, on most things except security, China far outpaced Russia. Russia was a bigger security actor, but in almost everything else was actually quite insignificant, of course, except for food trade, which is something that I think we're all going to be thinking about very, with a lot of dismay in the coming months. But the one thing we did see is you don't see a lot of coordination between Russia and China when they look at the region. I don't think they have, a coherent policy wherein they're acting in tandem. I think they both have different interests. I think they're using their relationship as a force multiplier. When China cooperates with certain countries in the Middle East and Russia also cooperates with certain countries, it forces the U.S. to engage on two fronts rather than one, just making it a more complex environment for the U.S. But I don't think really that there's any evidence at this point that I'm aware of that the two countries are actually working together to try to, play any kind of larger role. I think what both leaders in both countries have said frequently, that they have a different vision for international order, not that they want to overturn the entire system. They want to see a system in which they have a bigger voice. Chinese leaders say they want a more democratic order. Of course, they don't saying democratic means they can push the buttons in Washington, but what they really mean is they want a bigger say in setting the rules. And the Russians have often referred to a polycentric order, that they also want to be engaged in an international order based on, the United Nations and all the other things that have given them so many benefits, but with a lesser role for the U.S. So I'll stop here. I could really talk about this stuff all day and night, but I'm sure the other speakers have some interesting stuff too. Thanks, Karim.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Great notes, great comments. We all appreciate a lot of food for thought. I would like to also welcome Dina Facusta Behrens, an associate fellow with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Dina served as head of its Middle East and North Africa program, formerly the EU Middle East Forum since March 2011. Dina, if you can provide your point of view on the situation in general, but also I would like you to focus a little bit on Egypt, which is a big actor which we tended to overlook today in its importance and in its geostrategic aspirations and developments. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you to the Atlantic Council, and also to Alisa and the Center for American Studies. It's a pleasure to be here with you, with this distinguished panel. It's good to focus because we're actually doing like a tour de force really going through so many complex files and issues in the region. So I'm happy I can focus on Egypt, and then I'll also have some general remarks about some things that were said. And actually what I would say is also very much related to the question of Yael, when she asked, well, when it comes to this great power competition in the region, how can really the US and European partners be most effective? And I think really before we answer this question, it is important to look at how the states in the region view these states themselves. And I'll focus here on the Egyptian-Russian relationship. And indeed, you know, the invasion of Russia, the Ukrainian invasion of Russia really disrupted the Russian invasion of Ukraine really disrupted so much what the Egyptian president has been building up for a couple of years now. And of course, it also comes with serious crises, you know, food crisis, fuel crisis, but actually it really goes to the core of what he really, as a strategy, developed for the past years. So when Sisi came to power, as you all might know, you know, the relations with the US was pretty chilly because, of course, the Obama administration, they asked for democratic reforms, they lamented about the human rights violations, and the Egyptian president, but also others in the region, they were anyway pretty shocked by how the West reacted to the Arab uprisings and how easily they dropped their so-called partners, whether it's Mubarak, whether it's Qaddafi, whether it's Ben Ali. And that was a moment where he realized, well, we shouldn't over-rely on our relationship with the US or the West in general. He wants to diversify his external relations. He doesn't want to put all eggs into one basket. And of course, you know, with Putin, the two men really got along very well because, you know, both of them have this military background, they have a similar mindset. And, you know, over the past years, the relations between the two sides really started to evolve, and they started cooperating in the economic realm, in the political realm, and in the military realm. So, for example, Russia is also supposed to build Egypt's first nuclear power plant, which is supposed to actually start this summer. They're both cooperating militarily, so you have joint naval exercises. Of course, actually, Russia actually became really the second biggest arms supplier to Egypt, which is quite considerable. There are other investment programs. I mean, Russia is investing in the Suez Canal zone, and of course, and here I come to the, you know, to the outfall of the Ukrainian war. You know, Russians and Ukrainians, they really constitute like 1/3 of tourists coming to Egypt. So here, you know, the war really has a drastic effect on the Egyptian economy. And of course, now you have, you know, the food crisis. You know, Egypt is importing 80% of its grains from Russia and Ukraine, which is quite serious. You have the food prices rising. So now with this invasion, of course, you know, the country that is already struggling because of the pandemic and has really a lot of issues of indebtedness, of unemployment, you know, you name it, is now facing even more crises. And I think that the Egyptian government now is really in a tricky situation because now they also see, interestingly, that Russia is not performing that well militarily in Ukraine. And I really do think that this does make, you know, a difference in the mindset of someone like the Egyptian president, seeing that, well, maybe, yes, we've been, you know, getting so much supplies from Russia, but actually their performance now in the Ukraine, we're a bit puzzled by how, you know, the strongman Putin wasn't able to calculate the situation properly, and there were so many, obviously, misinterpretations of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. So this is, I think, making Egypt also now reconsider a bit, you know, this relationship with Russia. And of course, the question is, will Russia be able to continue its involvement in the region and its engagement? So, for example, this nuclear power plant, I will put a big question mark of whether this will really materialize. The same holds true for other economic programs that they are jointly trying to realize, because, you know, the Russian economy is now seriously damaged by the sanctions, and the economy was not performing very well even before the invasion. And we know, you know, Russia has a problem of a non-diversified economy. It relies heavily on fossil fuels. So the question is really, will Russia continue its engagement in the region as before, given the situation now in Ukraine and given that its resources are really being drained? And we already hear that, for example, they are handing over military bases in Syria to the Iranians. But I really must say that, despite this situation now with Russia, for Egypt, but this also holds true for many other countries in the region, this multipolar order is very much in their interest, and they're favoring it. And I think it's important to underscore it because they use it as a bargaining chip in their different relations, whether it's with Europeans, whether it's with the US. And actually the mentality is, well, we try to extract as much as possible from each relation, and we shouldn't rely too heavily on one side. So I think it's important to understand they're favoring this order. And of course, Jonathan, is true, and Yael also, when you compare the numbers of US engagement when it comes to, for example, investments in Egypt or in the region, or when you look at European trade with Egypt, still those countries are the most important ones. But nevertheless, a country like Egypt still wants to nurture more other relations and capitalize on these as well. So I think really that's important, and this strategic ambivalence, I would call it, that Egypt is exercising a bit, it will also continue. But now, I would say it is a good point in time to maybe try engage more with Egypt and lessen a bit, its cooperation or like its alliance with Russia, because the country is really in need of solving so many pressing crises. You named it, there's the food crisis, it's the energy crisis. So I feel that this is a good moment to engage in Egypt and to try maybe to substitute a bit what Russia will not be able to really fulfill any longer, given the situation in Ukraine. And maybe in this context also, I do think that Russia is losing, a bit, but nevertheless, Egypt and other countries will continue to diversify their relations because they don't want this over-reliance on Western powers. And I think we need to understand this. So if we now win Egypt, try to bring it closer, have more cooperation, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're part of this camp, this so-called Western camp. There will always be a bit ambivalence, and when a point comes where there can, extract benefits from a different relationship, then they definitely would do. So I think we have to really be aware, it's not that the West is no longer a natural ally for these countries. Maybe one point concerning also the European unity when it comes to dealing with the region, because we heard also that it's important that the U.S. That they coordinate with European partners when dealing with the region, when trying to tackle different challenges there. But I can tell you, for example, that when it comes to China, if U.S. really wants to contain China also more in the region, for example, a country like Germany might not really follow suit. I was, for example, that was quite interesting. I was part of like a workshop by the T7. The T7 is like the Think 7, which are like preparatory meetings for the G7 meetings. And there, of course, the issue of China came up, but also of Russia and how to deal with Russia, and that G7 has to cooperate with the G20 in order to solve so many pressing issues. And high officials from the German Foreign Office, they said, also from the Chancellery, they said, we have to engage with China. There's no way we cannot, because as you know, Germany is heavily reliant also on China, right? On there are really deep trade and economic relations between the two sides, and Germany is, for example, also dependent on importing, like the metals, rare earths. So also very important components for the energy transition, because these are things that you need, in order to invest in and develop renewable energies. So I just want to highlight this a bit, that when it comes to China, for example, Germany is seeing the situation differently, and even with Russia, and that was a bit shocking for me, to be frank, because we're still in the middle of this war, and now actually we're trying to, really increase sanctions and put pressure on Putin to stop this war. But you would hear again from high-level officials at some point, well, we have to engage with Russia, then there will be maybe a compartmentalization of relations with Russia. We would be adversaries on certain files, but still we have to engage. And of course, to a certain degree, this is true because, if you want to tackle food security, if you want to tackle climate change, I mean, it's also also China, they have to be on board, right? So we cannot really antagonize them in a way to lose them in these battles. We're dependent also on their engagement on very important files, generally speaking. So I think this is, so when it comes to unity, because we're talking a lot about unity, but actually the Europeans themselves are not unified as well. I think we haven't tackled that issue in the first place. So yeah, maybe I'll stop here and we can see.
Thank you very much, Lina. Very excellent work. Now, last but not least, I have my friend Valeria Talbot, the co-head of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the Institute for International Political Studies in Milan. She's also a lecturer at the Master in Middle Eastern Studies at the Catholic University and at the University of Milan. Are you with us? Oh, there she is. Ciao, Valeria. Given these geopolitical shifts, how can Italy, to conclude with the Italian position itself in a way that endorses its national interest, what should Italy do? What can Italy do to support the United States, the European, other actors, and try to help in tackling these many issues that we have seen in the Middle East and in North Africa?
Thank you very much, Karim, for your question. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. Many thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Centro Studi Americani. So Italy's geography and national interest place the country at the center of the Mediterranean region. So how geopolitical shifts in the Mediterranean are affecting Italy, its national interest and foreign policy is a crucial question for the country. Unfortunately, there has not always been convergence between Italy's national interest on one side and the action Italy has adopted to secure them on the other. This lack of coherence in some cases has damaged not only Italy's role in the region, but also the credibility and the effectiveness of its external action. In addition, European countries' competing interests and foreign policy agendas have been a further source of frictions that have weakened the development of a coherent policy. But what are Italy's priority in the Mediterranean, or in the Mediterranean, in the wider Mediterranean, I should say? As from an Italian perspective, we talk about the wider Mediterranean to indicate the geopolitical area that goes from North Africa to the Middle East and the Gulf, and also extends to the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, as dynamics in all these sub-regions are closely intertwined. So what are Italy's priorities? And these priorities correspond to challenges at the same time. Avoiding fragmentation and power vacuum. Fostering political stability and economic prosperity. Third, securing energy supplies and trade routes. Fourth, managing migration flows. And last but not least, countering terrorism. The increased role of regional and external players, Russia and China above all, may also pose a further challenge, in particular when we talk about Russia, especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine and the imposition of sanctions against Russia. As we have seen, and as the other speakers mentioned, Russia has increased its strategic role in the wider Mediterranean over the past decade and has strengthened economic and military relations with many countries in the region. However, the war in Ukraine is likely, as Dina mentioned, is likely to affect Moscow's role in the region. And it remains to be seen how and to what extent this will impact on regional dynamics. When we talk about the priority areas, priority countries of Italy's interest, Libya undoubtedly come first for historical reasons, as well as for political, economic, and energy links. So it is not surprising that over the past decade, Italian foreign action in the wider Mediterranean has mainly focused on Libya, not only on Libya, but mainly. Here, indeed, are concentrated major challenges to Italy's national interest, from instability in the region to migration flows to terrorism. However, so far, Italy has not been able to translate its efforts into significant results. The lack of a coherent policy and the past ambiguity harmed Italy's position in Libya, leaving room of maneuver and influence to other players. And we know that Libya has become a playground of external players' rivalries. And in the war in Ukraine may open new scenarios in the country. But against this backdrop, Italy needs to develop a coherent action for the stabilization of Libya, in cooperation with the UN, the US, with other EU states like Germany and France. With France, Rome has started to coordinate over the last year some action, thus overcoming previous divergences. In my opinion, Italy should also engage with those regional players like Turkey that have interest at stake in Libya and with Italy as closer relations. The war in Ukraine seems to have fostered a new convergence between Rome and Ankara, and this new convergence may also include deeper cooperation in Libya, as well as stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. So besides the Ukraine conflict, both Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean are likely to be on the agenda of the next bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Mario Draghi and Turkish President Erdogan at the beginning of July in Turkey. As far as national interest, Italian national interest is concerned, Italy has been particularly active in the wake of the war in Ukraine to look for alternative sources of energy, for alternative energy supplies to reduce its dependence on hydrocarbon, on the Russian hydrocarbon. And it has been very active in negotiating additional gas supplies with North African gas producers, namely Algeria and Egypt. Despite Italy's activism in securing its national interest in the energy sector, there are risks that cannot be neglected because depending on other countries is always a risk, and dependence is especially risky when we talk about energy supplies. As the current tensions with Russia show. And the risk may emerge from the stability of North Africa, and this instability over the past decade has forced Italy to turn more and more to Russia to compensate decreasing energy export from Libya. So in my view, this new energy deal may be the first step for a wider cooperation, a cooperation that goes beyond gas, that goes beyond hydrocarbon, to include renewable energies, to include the green transition, sustainable development, and facing common challenges like climate change, and also the challenge of food security in the region. I stop here and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valeria. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Great intervention from all our speakers. I have barely the time for maybe one question from the public, if you have any. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question to any one of our panelists? Okay, well then, let's join me, please, in thanking our panelists, excellent panelists, for the intervention, both in person as well as online. And thanks again, and thanks all for all of you for having joined us today. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you, Stas. Been great. Thanks. Very interesting.